You guys, I'm gonna put some lip gloss on so my lips aren't super dry and take this off. So I was working in the garage today and I was working with um my sister's class too. And it was been so hot. My bangs. I jumped in the pool after, thought it'd be somewhat clean for the show. I'm just in the garage. Um got 27 drawers. Um like designated and stuff. So and before that I got I don't know, 4? Like 5 in the living because I know before I had done that and they got messed up again, and I haven't felt the ability to do it for a while, and I think got momentum with the clutter. Oh, did I tell you I also got 2 bags of trash out? Well, 2 bags with the clutter and another bag I have cat trash from the kitchen, but that's just regular. You're gonna have anyway for the most part. 27 bags. No, um, I mean, I'm sure I have, um, over the last weeks at least, but not in one day. That would be like indiscriminately just thrown out, which I'm trying to keep cute things to wear for you guys and stuff, be more organized. So, new chapter. As we know, they're not really labeled until it's like sections. I don't know how close we are to the next section. Yeah, I'm not even seeing if we'll get there tonight then. Actually, like, are they not even sectioned off like that? Or are they just like they hop around? Because um right, this one says as an adult. And anyway, so I didn't title it because I thought they would think it's like, oh, you're saying adult content. No. Um, but it says Ada tried to recall her father's face, or when Ada tried to recall her father's face, it was often and regrettably. So that's the first word, regrettably, of the second line. So I just picked that one. Titled regrettably. That's all. Um, all right. Let me pull you guys up. Okay. I got a coffee over there. Got my mutt up here with her chew. Okay. Oh wait, I'm gonna put some. Might put some heels on. I'm gonna put on these sparkly ones. I know my legs are so sore, and they were from like so much work I did yesterday. To what I've been going through. I think I ripped these. It's okay. I got shorts on. We're good. My legs are sore. At one point I had those lidocaine patches. I had one here, like a 2 on each leg, and then also my back. Power through. Yes, feel it. Oh, feel it right there. Hmm. Yes. Hi. I'm just like remembering yesterday how her father, David, like took off and then he's like, well, I told you I'd be out for work. And she's like, David? Mm, learn how to be a real father. He's just It's not panties, but it's like going up. It's not that. They're like a squirts trying to like, yeah. If I have to change, I will. Oh, I'm weak. I'm weak. Okay, I think that looks better. Okay. Mm. Dave, regrettably, this version of him that she thought of, David, looking mad, ski goggles pushed back on his head, his shirt sleeves rolled up. There was little connection to David as he normally was, placid, reserved, attentive. This David was growing increasingly stubborn with every additional question he was asked. He had been in New York City, he said, meeting with the chair of the computer science department at NYU. Ada tried to convince him to come back with her to Liston's, but he wouldn't. She studied him for a moment. Really, this is silly, Ada, he told her. A simple misunderstanding. I'm in the middle of an experiment. He held forth the notepad he was carrying, as if by way of explanation, pointed to the device on his head. Wait right here, then, said Ada, and she ran to get Liston. Inside Liston's house, Liston was pouring the pasta into a colander in the sink. Steam rose up from the boiling water and wilted her hair. He's back, Ada told her. He says he was out of town for work. He says he told me. Maybe I forgot. It pained her to say it. Liston looked at Ada uncomprehendingly for a moment, and then followed her out the door, down the street to her house. By the time they reached David, he was back in the basement, bent over the device he had been wearing, turning into place a tiny screw. Shh, he said as Liston began to speak. Honestly, David, said Liston, enough of this. He straightened and then looked wounded. You've been gone for almost 48 hours, said Liston. Where were you? I was in New York for work, he said slowly. For heaven's sake, I wasn't gone long at all. But his face was changing. What work? She asked him. He looked down at the workbench, spun the device on the table in a full circle. Liston folded her arms. It's time to tell Ada, said Liston. David, do you hear me? They brought Ada to the living room to deliver the news. Later, she recalled wondering perversely if this was what it was like to have both a father and a mother. They sat together across from her. She was on a little chair that David said had come from his grandmother. They were on a leather sofa that David attended to from time to time with an oil that smelled like lemons. David looked at Liston for help, but she shook her head. He cleared his throat. 2 years ago, he began, at Liston's insistence, I visited a doctor for the first time in quite a while. There, I was instructed to return for further testing. Upon doing so, I was informed that it was likely that I might be in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. I disagree with that assessment. I still do. He paused. How familiar are you with Alzheimer's disease? He asked. Ada considered and then said she knew what it was. She had read about it in some book or other, or perhaps more than one book. It was part of her vocabulary. She pictured it as a slow gray fog that rolled in over one's memory. She pictured it seeping in through the doors and windows as they spoke, invading the room. She felt cold. Have you been back to the doctor since then? Ada asked. Liston glared at David. No, he said hesitantly. What? He said to Liston. There's nothing they can do for me, even in their diagnosis, if their diagnosis is correct. You seem fine, Ada said to him and to Liston and to herself. I am, he said. Don't worry too much about this, Ada. He said, I'm quite all right. Ada could feel the tension between David and Liston. She knew, though she was young, what was causing it. It was Liston's wish to protect her with honesty, and David's to protect her and himself with optimism. I always thought, like, it would be quite sad to have a parent have all dementia, like, to love someone so much and watch them slipping, like, although I guess that's how you feel about me most of the time when I can't remember shit. Okay. Wishfulness, some willful ignorance of his impending fate. I think David might have told me he'd be going out of town, actually, said Ada. I can't remember now. It was a lie. Of course it was a lie. Liston looked at her sadly. You see, said David, but Liston didn't respond. Finally, in the midst of their silence, Ada stood up. She turned to Liston. I guess I can stay here now, she said, and she excused herself and walked slowly up the stairs to her bedroom, which was as unfrilled and austere as a man's wallpapered in a brown plaid that the previous owners had chosen. She'd been reading The Way of a Pilgrim like Franny Glass, and although she was not religious, she said the Jesus prayer aloud, quietly, 5 times. She told herself that everything would be fine because she could imagine no alternative, because no life existed for her outside of David. In a week, the Boston Department of Children and Families came to visit them. Liston had called Officer Gagnon to let them know that David had been found, but they were concerned enough about his disappearance to investigate. David was appalled. He sulked his way through the home visit with a woman named Regina O'Brien, a gray lady with gray hair. To her questions, he gave single-word answers, sometimes unsubtly rolling his eyes, in order to offer an explanation for an absence that had brought the police to their home. David was forced to reveal his diagnosis to the DCF. His first proposal that he had simply forgotten to tell Ada that he'd been going out of town had seemed to alarm them more than it assured them of his competence. Then came a question that David and Ada had not prepared for in advance. Miss O'Brien looked at Ada and asked how she was doing in school. Ada paused. She looked at David, who looked at Miss O'Brien and told her that Ada was doing very well in school. It was not perhaps a lie if one counted David's method of educating her at his laboratory as school. He had always been hazy about homeschooling Ada. In that decade, everyone thought it was odd and eccentric, but not out of line with the rest of David's odd, eccentric behavior. Everyone, including Ada, seemed to accept that he had worked something out with the state. In that moment, for the first time, it occurred to Ada that perhaps he never had. It must have occurred to Regina O'Brien, too, for she looked at Ada levelly and asked her what school she attended. She panicked. She looked at David, who said nothing. She thought she should lie. Woodrow Wilson, she said, naming a nearby middle school, uncertain whether it was even the one she'd been sent to, or she would be sent to. And what grade are you in? Asked Miss O'Brien. Eighth, said Ada. Miss O'Brien paused. And what's your favorite teacher there? She asked. At last, David interjected. She doesn't go anyplace. I teach her, he said. I provide an education for her at home and at my place of work. And from the look on Miss O'Brien's face, Ada knew that they were deeply in trouble. Later, in the 1980s, a series of cases worked their way through the Massachusetts courts that would define the laws that now govern the idea of homeschooling. In Care and Protection of Charles and Others, one will find an overview of what is now required of homeschoolers in the state of Massachusetts. Prior approval from the superintendent and school board for one, access to textbooks and resources that public school children use for another. David and Ada had neither. In 1984, David's failure to enroll his daughter in any school was only further evidence of his neglect in the eyes of the DCF. He seemed not to recognize the severity of the allegations against him. He felt it was impossible that they could take his child from him. Absurd. He told Liston it would not happen. But after that first visit, their lives began to change. The DCF commanded David to enroll Ada in an accredited school. Miss O'Brien recommended to her supervisor that home visits be continued, and social services required David to see a doctor regularly to monitor the progress of his disease, to see whether and how fast he was progressing toward parental incompetence. Incompetence, the word that Liston had once used in reference to him. Incompetence, the opposite to Ada of her father's name. Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a saying like bad cases make bad laws. Like, it's like, because for most people, you would think like that are going to homeschool their kids, there wouldn't be an issue. But all it takes is like some psychopath. Like, that's when it's like a bad case, like actually bad people that cause there to need to be requirements. And then everyone has to follow. Because if there weren't those people that made it that way, like made it where there had to be a fuss about it, then there wouldn't have been. But there's probably were some people out there that were like, like I heard of a woman like in like Connecticut or something that had like kept her son in the basement for like his whole life. And he was like almost an adult or something, and it was like starving to death. Those type of things, like, not that there's not laws against starving people, but like if she'd have said, oh no, he's homeschooled and I'm educating him, I'm like, you know what I mean? So because most people would not do that, but because of that, there need to be like laws. Yeah, exactly. I think we should blame more so the monsters out there. That's like, because then people would be like, well, why isn't the government doing something? Like, okay, you guess we have to. The Queen of Angels School was a brown brick building, 4 stories high, set close to the sidewalk. One wide, short flight of stairs led to 6 unpretty industrial doors, painted a dull dark blue. Its roof, surrounded by high chain link fences on all sides, was used for gym class in warm weather. Its lower windows had metal bars running from top to bottom, added several decades after the school was first built, an attempt to calm paranoid parents who increasingly saw Dorchester as a place to be feared, and its upper windows were narrower and more numerous than what would have been standard for the building, which gave it the look of a city wall. On a Wednesday in September, more than a week after the school year had begun for everyone else, Ada walked for the first time into the Queen of Angels lower school. Liston were with her. Liston and David were with her. All three had taken the day off of work. For the weeks following the DCF visit, there had been a debate. David had wanted to enroll her in the public junior high, but Liston had insisted that they would not do. So, grumblingly, David and Ada and Liston had gone at the start of the month to meet with Sister Aloysius, the principal, and Mr. Hanover, the president, both of whom were in charge of welcoming new students into their fold. In the high ceilinged office occupied by the latter, the three of them sat and listened to a speech about the benefits of a Catholic education, the moral enlightenment Ada would receive, the community provided by the school. David leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, looking down at the floor, the top of his bald head catching lights from the window and shining. He sat up, stretched his arms and legs uncomfortably, sighed out heavily once or twice. Liston glared at him. Ada hoped that no one else noticed. The two administrators were tactful about her history, referring to her homeschooling only vaguely, euphemistically, as if it might behoove everyone to forget about it entirely. Ada assumed that Liston, who was well known in the Queen of Angels parish and active in the school, had prepped them thoroughly. Ada listened attentively to everything that was said, looking around with interest at the decorations and the architecture, the crucifixes on the walls. Above all, the doors, the ancient ticking clocks in metal cages, the colors of the school, which had most likely been redone in the previous decade and consisted mainly of muted modernist tones, pea green, goldenrod, maroon. She felt in certain ways that she had breached a castle wall. She had so often walked past Queen of Angels and scanned its exterior for signs of what it must be like inside. As outsiders, David and Ada had always been only hazily aware of the ways in which Dorchester was divided. Though it interested David, and he often asked Liston to describe it, to Liston to her children and friends, one's parish was more important than one's neighborhood or one's street. The first floor of Queen of Angels contained the local parish school, a grammar school, perhaps 200 students in some, from kindergarten through 8th grade, but the upper floors contained a central diocesan high school that drew from 7 different parochial schools, including the one beneath it. And so, beginning in the 9th grade, the school widened into a river of students from a broader swath of Dorchester and some from the city beyond. Nearly everyone in Savin Hill, including all 3 Liston boys, attended. Queen of Angels, Maddie and Gregory in the lower school, William in the upper. Liston herself had gone there for her entire education as a girl. This was the only fact about school that David found, or the school that David found at all reassuring. Well, I suppose it did all right by Liston, he said to Ada, but a note of skepticism still made its way into his voice. Ada would enter as an eighth grader based on her age and not much else, and be placed among students who had known each other for years. Aloysius assured her that she would blend right in. At one point, she leaned in toward Ada kindly and put a hand on the desk. Ada, dear, she said, if ever you find yourself unable to grasp something or falling behind in a course, don't hesitate to come to me for help. At this, David's head jerked to attention, and finally he spoke. There is no question that Ada will be able to grasp what you put before her, he said, a sort of quiet viciousness making its way into his voice. In fact, I'd go so far as to say she'll throttle it. The question is whether you'll be able to provide my daughter with the sort of that will offer her even the slightest challenge. Or do you, he said, or do you, he said, and then he lost his words. All of them, including David, fell for a moment into silence. I can guarantee you, sir, began Mr. Hanover, at the same time that Liston stood up and thanked them for their time. Do you have any questions? Asked Sister Aloysius, looking only at Ada, and Ada shook her head quickly in response. Later that day, Liston called to ask whether Ada would like her boys to walk her to school in the morning. She declined, not wanting to saddle them with her, feeling sure that the request would be a burden to them. The recent turmoil in her life had momentarily supplanted her crush on William as the place her thoughts wandered when left undirected. She realized that she had not daydreamed about him for a week. In the evening, David mustered up some tea and made them both dinner. Whatever you like, Ada, he said. She had chosen pot au feu, a special favorite of hers that David made only on occasion, and went with him to the butcher on Dot Ave to pick up the beef. She let him amble ahead of her and concentrated on his walk, memorizing it, wondering what it would be like to be without him. For the past several weeks, she had been investigating Alzheimer's disease on her own. With the help of the scholarly library at the bit, she had discovered two things. First, that the disease typically moves at a fairly sedate pace. Life expectancy in that decade was thought to be about 8 to 10 years from diagnosis, but it had been over 2 years already since he was first forced by Liston to see a doctor, and if Ada was honest with herself, she had been noticing symptoms of forgetfulness for longer than that. She had been convincing herself for years that David had always been absent-minded. The second bit of information that she learned more troublingly was that when the disease was diagnosed in younger people, its progression was often more rapid. David was 59, well below the age literature listed as the cutoff point between early onset Alzheimer's and the more typical variety. And in early onset patients, the disease can move quite fast, 2 or 3 years until the individual's comprehension skills were entirely lost. Oh, thank you, Jerry. Until, the individual was no longer verbal. After that, quite rapidly, the function of his muscles and all his reflexes would shut down completely. Ada had squeezed her eyes shut against this possibility. She told herself it would not happen, that David would be the exception. The butcher's shop was busy with customers, but the owner knew and loved her father. What can I get you, Professor? He asked, his perpetual name for David and for anyone in the neighborhood who manifested signs of formal education. And David, leaning forward, his hands behind his back, selected his cut of beef carefully, brought it home, cooked it up for Ada while she sat in the kitchen and talked to him, her father, her best and most important ally in the world. I'll tell you something, Ada, said David. He turned to look at her, pushed his glasses, steamy from the pot of water he had been boiling on the stove, back up on his nose. It's going to be a different lab without you there. Quite different lab altogether, he said. I know Liston's really going to miss you. I'll miss her too, said Ada. She was talking, of course, about her father, just as he was talking about her. Their old and comfortable house filled up with the smell of herbs and onions and garlic, and Ada thought in that moment that it might not all be so bad. Liston had warned her not to be late, so before she went to bed, Ada had consulted the schedule she'd received, noting the start time of all the classes. Her first was at 8 a.m., and she planned on arriving at 7:50 just to be safe. At breakfast, David was quiet. He did not know what to say to her. She could tell that he felt he had failed her. Then he asked, as if it had just occurred to him, what she would use to carry her books. And she pointed to a canvas bag on the floor that she had scavenged from the basement. Oh dear, said David, that won't do the trick. Wait here, he said, and he went into his office and emerged proudly with a brown briefcase that unlocked only when a 5-digit code was entered mechanically onto a rotating combination lock. David had not used it in years, but it had been an object of fascination for Ada when she was small. He had programmed the lock with a number he promised she could guess. As a smaller child, she had spent hours entering guessable numbers, her birthday and then her birthday backwards, his birthday forward and backward, the address of their house with 3 zeros in front of it. But she never guessed correctly. Every now and then, still, she walked into his office and idly tried a new idea. It's yours, he said to her proudly. She took it from him. She was pleased. She felt professional, suddenly, like her own person. You never guessed the code? He asked. Ada shook her head. It's just code, the word code, using alphanumeric substitution, he said happily. No shifts, stupidly simple, the sort of password that longs to be cracked. Ada had long ago memorized a table that listed each letter next to its corresponding number, 1 through 26. She turned the dials on the combination lock, 3 for C, 15 for O, until they read 31545, and then pressed 2 buttons to its right and left, and the latches opened with a satisfying muted pop. Inside the briefcase was empty, lined with a silk material that was yellowing in places. One half of the briefcase bore little elasticized compartments meant to hold writing implements and notepads. And David now took a pen from his shirt pocket and tucked it into place inside one. He walked back into his office and came out again, holding an unlined pad of white paper, stationery from the Steiner lab that David had ordered en masse 5 years ago. He handed this to Ada as well. There, he said, now you're all ready. Shall I walk you to school? He asked her. I'll be okay, said Ada. In fact, she would have liked him too, but she wanted to demonstrate to him that she'd be all right, to show him that she was grown up now, to lessen his guilt, which that month had manifested itself in ways that Ada had begun to notice. He looked at her for longer than usual. He asked her more often what she'd like to do in the evening or on weekends. A dark shadow crossed his brow now whenever he could not locate a word or phrase, which happened many times each day. The night before, in the middle of a glass of sherry, he had apologized to her. I should not have put you in the position in which you now find yourself, said David. I was trying to do what I thought was right, but I fear I made everything worse. I'll be all right, Ada had said, reassuringly. Oh, my dear, I feel as if I'm throwing you to the wolves, said David, genuflecting to the cross, learning the rosary, confessing your sins to Father so and so. Good heavens, he said. He took a pensive sip. Sometimes I still think I should have sent you to public school, he said. But Liston knows best, I suppose. He had packed both of them lunches the night before, as he often did, but that day, for the first time, Ada would be taking hers separately. Carrying it herself, she put the brown bag inside her briefcase, squashing it slightly when she closed it. Feeling the give of the bread, they walked together over the bridge, and then, at the main intersection that followed, Ada turned left and David turned right. What is it that I tell you here? Asked David. Have a good day, I suppose. His face looked pinched, slightly red around the nose. Ada stood apart from him. She did not know how to comfort him. She needed comforting herself. He looked at her ruefully. Don't take them too seriously, he said. Finally, don't take anything too much to heart, Ada, all right? She nodded solemnly, and then she watched her father as he walked away, carrying his own briefcase down by his side. She longed in that moment to go with him, to run after him, to sigh deeply and contentedly as she settled into her work at the lab. Instead, she turned finally and walked in the opposite direction. Her head was down like David's head. From above, they would have looked like mirror images of one another, one larger, one smaller. A Rorschach test, a paper snowflake unfolded, two noblemen pacing away from one another in preparation for a duel. It was a short walk to Queen of Angels from there. She tightened her right hand around the handle of the briefcase. It made her feel professional, secure, as if she were clasping her father's hand. When she arrived, she found she was alone. No other students were in sight. That's going to really help her fit in, bringing a briefcase to school. And the first floor windows were too high to see inside from street level. Ada walked up the steps, feeling increasingly ill at ease. At the top of them, she tried the handle of a door and found that it was locked. She tried another, locked. She stood for a moment outside, wondering about her next move. A large part of her wanted to turn and walk home. I tried, she imagined saying. The door was locked. She did not yet feel that she had any obligation to the school. She did not feel yet that she lacked agency or the right of self-governance. In her life, Ada had rarely been told that she could not do something she wished to do, because all of her desires aligned so completely with the desires of those around her, because her deference to her father and all of his colleagues meant that her requests were usually very reasonable and very small. All of her life, she had operated in the world of adults, and the world of adults had welcomed her. Now, if she decided that it was reasonable that she turn and walk home, but as she reached the bottom of the steps, one of the dark blue doors opened behind her and a low voice issued forth. Going, said the voice. Ada turned around. The man in the doorway was small and stern. He had gray hair parted sharply to the side of his head and brown pants and a wide, short brown tie. Nowhere, she said. She was surprised into saying it. Were you leaving? The man asked. I was trying to get in, said Ada. The door was locked. And knocking is something you're not familiar with? He asked her. She had never been spoken to in this way, so harshly. I'm new, said Ada, by way of explanation. She began to dig in the pockets of her shirt for her schedule so she could show him, but the man was already coming toward her. Shockingly, he took her by her elbow. She had not ever been away. He brought her forward up the steps, pushing her ahead of him as if she might try to escape. And once she was inside, he pulled the door closed behind her with a crack. It was explained to her by the secretary when she reached the office that although her first class had begun at 8 a.m., homeroom was at 7:40 sharp. The front doors were closed and locked at 7:38 a.m. exactly. And after that, students were required to ring a bell to be let in, and their lateness was noted on their record. Ada was certain that this had not been explained to her on her first and only visit to the school, but it felt futile to protest. They were so certain of her guilt that it seemed better, more effective, to hang her head and nod. The secretary, Miss Duggan, donned her half-moon reading glasses to take a look at the schedule that she still held in both of her hands. She glanced up at the clock on the wall. 8:01, she said. You should be in Sister Margaret's class right now. And she walked Ada out of the office, down a short hallway around a corner. If you gone to your home room, you would have gotten your locker assignment, but we should get you to class now. You get it tomorrow, said Miss Duggan. Although it hadn't occurred to her yesterday, Ada now noticed the smell of the place, the famous schoolhouse smell that she had read about in so many of her favorite books. Chalk and soap and dust and metal. She took it in. Overhead, fluorescent lights flickered from time to time, distractingly. She reached Sister Margaret's classroom, and Miss Duggan turned to her. I'll introduce you to your student ambassador first, she said. You were supposed to meet her this morning. She opened the door and popped her head inside. Sister, she said, could I borrow Melanie McCarthy for a moment? After a pause, a girl emerged from the classroom and into the hallway. She looked at Ada unblinkingly. She was beautiful, the sort of girl that Ada suddenly and irreversibly realized she wanted to look like. It had never really occurred to her to want to look any particular way before. Melanie had very fair blonde hair that fell back and away from her face, held there by what seemed like permanent breeze. She had smooth, unblemished skin. Ada had noticed that lately her own had been less cooperative. That was tan still from the summer. Ada imagined she spent a great deal of time lying on a beach someplace or performing some wholesome athletic activity like field hockey. Her skirt fit her perfectly and fell to the tops of her kneecaps, which themselves were perfect. Her white socks were pulled to the top of her shins and folded over precisely. Ada was wearing ankle socks, scrunched down by her shoes, because she had nothing else to wear. Ada, this is Melanie, said Miss Duggan. She'll be your ambassador here at Queen of Angels. And Ada could tell by the way she looked at Melanie that here was a girl she approved of, a tidy girl with brushed hair and a family who donated the correct amount each year. The name of the school seemed in that moment to apply to Melanie herself. Ada extended her hand ever so slightly, the way she would have upon being introduced to a graduate student, and then retracted it. A handshake was not correct. She's in Group B with you, so she has the same schedule you do. If you have any questions, said Miss Duggan, she's the one to ask. Melanie said nothing. She smiled briefly and looked at Ada inquisitively. She was Ada's height exactly, and their eyes met quickly before Melanie turned them away back to Miss Duggan, who was thanking her for her kindness. And I'm sure Ada will thank you too, she added. Won't you, dear? She nodded. Miss Duggan rapped on the glass once with her knuckles and then opened the door. Sister Margaret inside was poised with her hand at the chalkboard, about to finalize some equation. Miss Duggan put a hand on Ada's shoulder and ushered her into the classroom. Melanie trailed behind, and then walked gracefully back to her desk and sitting, tucked one leg behind the other. Sister Margaret, said Miss Duggan. Class, this is Ada Sibelius. She's new here. Ada, why don't you tell the class a little about yourself? She and the hallway monitor had both pronounced her last name incorrectly. Something like Sibelius, but Ada knew not to correct them. David would have. She had never been certain about how she'd acquired the few social skills that she possessed, which had always acted as a balance to David's lack thereof. Genes, perhaps, the genes of a surrogate mother who gave birth to her, or her interactions with the other members of the lab. Either way, Ada called upon them not to fail her in that moment, to produce the right response, the right introduction. She looked out into the sea of maroon and navy clad eighth graders, boys and girls, all returning her gaze impassively. She held her briefcase in her right hand and curled her fist around its handle more tightly as she struggled to bring words, any words at all, to mind. She dug her nails into her palms. Anything she could imagine saying felt too far-fetched, too bizarre. I've never been in a school before, she could say. My name is Ada Sibelius, and my favorite mathematician is Gauss. Finally, she settled on hi. Hi, she said. I'm Ada. I'm 13. I'm from Dorchester. Which was, of course, silly. They all were. The math class was incredibly basic. Ada had a suspicion it would be, but it was so simple that it was actually interesting to watch. At least at first. Sister Margaret was spending time on the multiplication of fractions, teaching the class in a slow, methodical way, drawing X's from top to bottom and bottom to top. Ada knew how to do this intuitively, but it had never been mapped out for her in that way, mechanically. Everything she knew of math was somehow more fluid, more instinctual than the diagrams that Sister Margaret was putting on the board. It felt like someone telling her how to speak, or by what method to put together an intelligible sentence. It felt like someone telling her how to access a memory, how to breathe. And yet, all around her, students were completing exercises given to them by Sister Margaret using the same cross-hatching technique she was demonstrating at the front of the room. She wrote a list of equations on the board and then roamed around the room silently as students put their hands down to work at the task. Ada put her briefcase atop her desk and carefully turned the dials into place and sprang the latches with a louder pop than she recalled. Several students around her turned to look, and it was then that she noticed the backpacks that were tucked neatly into baskets beneath each student's seat. Red and green and blue canvas bags with straps, the sort David called satchels. Instantly, her face colored, and she lifted and lowered the lid of her briefcase as quickly as she could, retrieving from it the pad of Steiner Laboratory stationery and the pen her father had tucked into place that morning. Then she pushed the briefcase under her desk. She began to work. After a moment, she felt a presence over her right shoulder, a shadow on the desk. In this class, we use pencils, said Miss Sister Margaret, more loudly than Ada thought necessary, and graphing paper. Ada looked up at her. She hovered there disapprovingly, her small mouth turned downward, her hands folded before her. How was I supposed to know this? Ada wanted to ask her. It was a question that had occurred to Ada perhaps 10 times that day already. How was I supposed to know any of this? She felt anger toward her father and listed in equal measure. Surely, Ada thought, they could have prepared her better than this. A sharp bell signaled the end of the period, and Ada took out her paper schedule to see what was next. English, then history, then physical education, then lunch, then home economics, then something called general science. She wondered what it might be, what they might plan on teaching her in a science course with no specialization. When she looked up again, she realized that every other student, including her ambassador, had left. And now students were coming into the classroom. She scurried out into the hallway and caught a glimpse at the end of it of Melanie McCarthy's bright blonde hair, her bright white knee socks as they disappeared around a corner. She ran to catch up, to follow the class to its next destination. No running, came the reprimand from an unknown voice behind her, and she broke her gait, but felt a sort of panic rising inside her. She did not know where A Hall was. Furthermore, she felt certain that she would cry if she had to ask anyone for help. She thought of her father, how easily he approached strangers, how little hesitation he had when it came to asking for what he needed. She wondered for the first time what he had been like in school. She had never once thought to ask him about it, perhaps because she had no experiences of her own to compare his to. But now she wished that she had. Instinctively, she knew that it would be a mistake to talk to anyone. She tucked her briefcase under her right arm and held it tightly there. It felt less conspicuous that way than it did while swinging in her hand. At last, she reached the end of the hallway and turned right 30 feet ahead. The rest of her class marched or skipped or slung arms familiarly around each other in a way that made her understand that they had moved through their entire education as one unit, that they knew each other's parents, that they had gone to each other's houses for sleepovers, that they played sports together in and out of school, that they knew each other's embarrassments and victories, and that they had come to terms with all of them and settled comfortably into groups and clusters and strata that it would take Ada years and years to accurately map. She was the last to arrive in her next class and in all of her classes. For the rest of the day, she gained a new textbook in every class, was instructed by every teacher to cover it in brown paper before the next day. They were bulky, these textbooks. She could fit only one in her briefcase. The rest she carried in the crook of one arm, wishing fruitlessly for the use of her other one. At lunchtime, she walked into the cafeteria and froze. It was then that she realized the extent of the stratification of the lower school, the broad and awkward age range from 5-year-old kindergartners to 13-year-old eighth graders, some of whom looked as if they might as well be teachers. And within those ages, the boys and girls divided themselves, and within two genders, they all seemed somehow divided by levels of attractiveness or confidence. Plunged forward, as if into cold water. Wildly, she scanned the room and saw the angelic head of Melanie McCarthy, wondered if she should approach her as the only other student she had formerly met. But Melanie was surrounded by other girls sitting shoulder to shoulder on both long benches, as close and tight as matchsticks in a box. Ada found the only empty table she could find, knowing somehow that it was not hers to take, that it belonged to a group that would very likely claim it in a moment. But she had no other options. She sat at the very end of it, took from her brief the paper bag that David had handed her that morning, its contents now squashed. After a few moments, the other half of the long table began to fill with boys who looked her age or slightly younger. None of them had been in her morning classes, seventh graders maybe. Nice briefcase, one of them said, with so much force that she imagined everyone in the cafeteria had heard. Ada glanced over quickly, but could not determine which boy it had been. The little group bent forward and backward, felled by their own laughter. She was holding her now, and she stiffened there, uncertain how to proceed. She felt endlessly observed. She lowered the sandwich and followed it with her eyes. She had never been so directly targeted before. Once or twice she'd been shouted at by another child on a walk to or from the store, or while going someplace else in the neighborhood, but on those occasions there was always the possibility of disappearance, of walking quickly in the opposite direction, pretending she hadn't heard. Here she was a stationary target, a sitting duck. She froze, still as a deer, keeping her eyes down, waiting for the tide of humiliation to wash over her and recede. Nice briefcase, the boy shouted once more, having successfully elicited a laugh from his friends the first time, and Ada saw then that it was a ruddy, freckled boy, quite small for his age. He looked back at her. Yeah, you, he said. I said I like your briefcase. Aren't you going to say thanks? Later, when she thought it likely that interest in her had faded, she stood up as quickly as she could, tucked her now hateful briefcase once more under her arm, and then asked the only adult she could find where the room was. Then she walked down the hallway, opened the bathroom door, and upon finding it empty, tucked herself into a stall. She set down her stack of textbooks and her briefcase on the floor. A wave of relief washed over her to be unseen inside something small, to be totally alone. She stayed there for 20 minutes, checking the digital wristwatch that David had given her, waiting for the bell. She looked at her schedule. She would not be late. Girls came into and out of the bathroom, holding forth on various subjects in rushed, enthusiastic bursts of language that Ada sometimes didn't understand. She noted their diction with interest, sentence structures she had never heard before, expressions she had only heard in restaurants or key. In the 1980s, the 1980s marked the dawn of like as a sort of linguistic master key, a shapeless, bendable word that fit into the crevices of sentences as perfectly as honey. The girls at Queen of Angels poured it over their speech greedily, and Ada mouthed it herself in her bathroom stall, practicing along with them as she often did with other members of the lab. At 11:54, when the bathroom was empty, Ada opened her briefcase on her lap. From it, she took the pen, the pad of paper, one textbook, and added them to the pile of textbooks she'd made on the floor. Then she tucked the empty briefcase into the nook between the toilet and the wall. She'd leave it there for the rest of the day. Her books didn't fit into it anyway. She let herself out of the stall and into the hallway once more, carrying her textbooks on her meager hip, and she walked to her next class. At the end of the day, when she returned to the bathroom nearest the cafeteria, she found that The briefcase was gone. She opened every stall door to make sure. She stood for a while, pondering what to do, wondering how she would explain it to David. In the mirror, she looked unlike herself. The foyer of the lower school was crowded with children, all jostling against one another to exit. Outside, she saw in her path a group of older boys from the upper school, some of them so much older that they seemed to her like men. The whole broad-shouldered bunch, they were standing in a group, some of them leaning against the wall of the school, others standing splay-ankled in the middle of the sidewalk. Groups of boys terrified her beyond all measure. Typically, if she saw them ahead of her on any walk, she crossed the street to avoid intersecting with them. But she had turned left out of the school doors, and the street was too busy to cross. And to turn around completely would have made her too visible. She continued head down, hoping to pass them unnoticed, when she heard her name. Ada, said one of them. She still had her eyes on the ground, and her instinct really was to keep going. But then he said it louder. She was past them already. She clutched her books more tightly to her chest and pivoted slowly on a heel. She could feel a deep, defeating warmth spreading downward from her scalp. She looked up at William Liston. Hi, she said, so quietly that she might as well have mouthed it. How was your first day? The other boys looked at her or away. Two of them continued whatever conversation they were having, uninterested. Okay, she said, trying to produce more volume this time, wondering what anyone else would do or say at this moment. Make a joke, perhaps, some tossed off line, some little act of self depreciation or school depreciation or deprecation that showed him she belonged. William Liston paused as if waiting for more. Cool, he said finally, and then turned back to his group. She understood that she was dismissed, and also understood that something further had been expected of her, a few more conversational twists and turns, and she racked her brain for anything, another word, another phrase, but she was not a native speaker of William's language, of the language of children. Suddenly, from behind her, she heard her name again. Ada, there you are, called a voice she recognized instantly as her father's. She froze. And William Liston, he added. Ada turned around slowly, nervously, and saw David on the opposite sidewalk, wearing the large glasses that had gone out of fashion half a decade before, one half of the collar of his shirt tucked in on itself messily. He did not look to the right before bounding out into the street, and the driver of the car that screeched to a halt in front of him rolled down the car's window to object. All right, said David, holding up a firm hand in the driver's direction. Let's not overreact. Ada had told him she would meet him at the lab after school. It had not been the plan for him to come here. All around her, she could hear a ceasing of conversation as her classmates stopped to watch the spectacle of David, his clothing flapping in ways she had never before noticed, his thin frame jangling along, elbows sticking out at odd angles. He reached the sidewalk and waved brightly to William, calling out his name once more, telling him hello. Hey, said William. One of his friends turned his back to all of them, presumably to hide his amusement. You're getting very grown, William, David called brightly, which caused a physical shudder to make its way from the top of Ada's head to her shins. Then he put one hand on her shoulder. Was it terrible? He asked her too loudly. Ada shook her head no. Her voice was still lost. Well, how was it? And where's your briefcase, my dear? David said. A giggle from someplace to her right. She looked down at the giant stack of books she was carrying in her arms and back up at her father. I lost it, she said slowly. He regarded her, his gaze, she saw that he knew what she had done, the intentionality with which she had misplaced the thing, and it shamed her. He would not have cared what anyone said, she thought, and she told herself that perhaps she was not so like him after all, that perhaps she lacked the best parts, the noblest parts of David. How on earth does one lose a briefcase? David said at last. And then, at last, he turned and walked toward home. And Ada followed. Her ears burned at the rumble behind her of a dozen conversations that resumed in hushed tones with more urgency and the low sounds of laughter that followed. That night, as she fell asleep, she thought about William, the great beauty of him, the way his sinews fit together in a neat finished puzzle, and she pondered for the first time in her life the particular flaws of David, which she had never before counted or even noticed, and she wondered what other people said about him when she was not there to hear them. From then on, every day Ada went to school, sat quietly, spoke to no one, waited for her day to end. So she longed for the lab, for her work. When no one was watching, she coded on the backs of her book covers until she was caught. At 2:15, she burst forth from the front door and walked as quickly as she could, without attracting undue attention, to the tea, and then took it to the lab to spend her afternoons there catching up. Part of her longing to be there was selfish. The work of the lab engaged her in ways that she thought her schoolwork never could. But part of it was out of fear, for David's work was beginning to falter. Now she took copious notes on everything he was tasked with doing. She had always attended meetings alongside him when she felt like it, but now she made a point to, jotting down items as if she were his secretary, his personal assistant. Quietly, she asked him questions, tried to jog his memory, tried to help him keep up with the demands of his position. Has Frank written in the abstract for JACM article? You should get it in by next week. Did you call McCarran back? At night, after quickly completing the homework that Queen of Angels had assigned, she dutifully told Elixir about her day, still eager to feel she was being useful to the lab, still relieved in some way to unburden herself to something else. And at last she turned to the work that David had assigned her before his decline. He wrote down assignments for her in marble composition books, the names of pieces of music he wanted her to listen to, the names of proofs he wanted her to solve, books, films, pieces of artwork, even wines that he particularly enjoyed, which he told her she could save for later in her life. Thank you, LaRoyal. Yeah, someone stole her briefcase. Rude. As she made her way through them, she derived a sense of satisfaction that far exceeded any she got from the homework the nuns assigned her. One day, she solved at last the Sierpinski proof. She shared this with no one. Next, she read a biography of FDR, and one of Winston Churchill, and one of Albert Einstein, and one of Isadora Duncan. Then 100 Years of Solitude, then Les Étrangers by Camus in French, Julian of Norwich's Revelations of Divine Love. Slowly and then quickly, David began to seem less and less interested in his research, which had therefore to sustained and engrossed him completely. It was frustrating to him now to get to the end of a task and not remember the beginning of it, to forget the names of devices and procedures that he used every day. She whispered them to him when she could, but she was not always there to help. and she could tell now that everyone knew. His colleagues began to look at him with sad and nervous eyes. Only Liston treated him normally, with a sort of brusque, business-like vigor that Ada appreciated. In the winter of Ada's first year in school, he disappeared twice more, both times for several hours, both times denying that he had been gone or insisting that he had merely gone for a walk. Where he had gone on his walks, he could not say. They did not go to New York that year for Christmas, nor did they have a Christmas tree. The possibility crossed Ada's mind that David hadn't even gotten her a present until late on Christmas night. She shyly produced hers for him. It was a rare early edition of the Castle of Oronto, a bizarre favorite of David's that she had found in an antique shop nearly a year ago and had been saving ever since. And he sprang to his feet. From upstairs, he produced a wrapped present for her. When she opened it, she saw that it was a sparkly, spangled sweater. She knew with certainty that it was Liston, not David, who had chosen it and wrapped it and bought it. By late January, she had stopped leaving him alone. Liston, without being asked, began to pick him up in the morning so that they could travel to the lab together. Ada kept herself awake at night, listening for footsteps descending the stairs, waiting for him to make a noise that would rouse her. She grew weary with fatigue. She grew tired of pretending to the rest of the lab that everything was all right. She hung the front door and the kitchen door with a dozen decorative jingle bells that she'd purchased on sale after Christmas at a nearby store. She rigged up a system that would drop a hammer on a pot when either door was open and rested slightly easier twice. Her makeshift alarm sounded in the night, and she bolted from her bed and chased after him down Shawmut Way, guiding him back to his bedroom gently, telling him he was sleepwalking. He was worse at night, or whenever he was tired, less lucid, nearly incapable of intelligent conversation. He called her mother once. Once he grabbed her by the wrist and placed her hand on his forehead as if to tell her she had a fever. He had a fever. Wordlessly, plaintively, it frightened Ada. He forgot her name completely on several occasions and regularly forgot the names of his colleagues. That one, he said, or you know the one. When the DCF agent stopped by, Ada prepped David subtly in advance, walking him through the questions Miss O'Brien would ask him by asking him them herself. By the end of their visits, he was tired, cantankerous, unlikable, and Ada would do her best to cheerfully distract Miss O'Brien. Despite all this, he protested that everything was fine. I'm perfectly all right, Ada, he said, in response to any line of questioning about his memory or emotional state. Really, I'd be much better if everyone would stop haranguing me constantly. For months and months, Ada tried to make herself believe that this was true. But at last, in March, shortly after she turned 14, Ada walked into his office at the lab. He was staring down at some paper work on his desk, but he did not seem to be processing it. When she entered, he looked up at her, blinking. Who is this one now? He said. She knew then that she could not pretend any longer. She walked resolutely down the hall to Liston's office and knocked on her door. She hated crying. It felt to her like a failure of will, a hot and humiliating display of weakness. David did not like it when she cried, and she had never once seen him do it. Miraculously, she held in her tears. Liston beckoned Ada toward her, pointed to a seat. I'm sorry, Ada said. Her throat was tight. She hiccuped. He needs to see another doctor, thought Ada, though she knew even then that there was nothing to be done. The disease was rolling in unstoppably, a powerful foreign front advancing. Liston convinced David to make her his executor shortly after that, when it became clear that the home visits by social services were going badly. Her childhood friend, Tom Mira, who worked for the DCF, had warned her. Ada, who had become masterful at eavesdropping in the last year, stood in the upstairs hallway of David's house, the receiver of a telephone extension pressed to her ear, the mouthpiece upended in the air. She breathed as lightly as she could, listening as her father and Liston negotiated her fate. They'll take Ada away from you, she heard Liston say. Don't think they won't. Really, Liston, said David, protesting, but in his voice, Ada heard something resigned and anxious. It would be best for Ada, David, said Liston. Right, wouldn't it? And it was then that Ada put the receiver gently down on the table, not wanting to hear anything more. She did not know whom to trust. Oh, thank you, Malemo. Only later did Ada learn all of the details of their arrangement. Mercifully, that year, they attempted to keep her protected from whatever backroom dealings in which the two of them were engaging. Even David, never one to shelter her from the affairs of grown-ups, undertook to baby her just a bit, given the circumstances, or perhaps more likely, he simply forgot to tell her. But over the course of the following months, it became clear to Liston, or that Liston and David had agreed, whether it was Liston's idea or David's. Ada was never certain that Liston would be designated Ada's legal guardian in the event that her father became unable to care for her. On April 1st, 1985, David resigned from the Steiner lab. He did not tell Ada he had done so. She found out only when a grad student let her know that she would really, really miss her father. He is just a great guy, said the student earnestly. A classic. There's not many like him anymore. A week later, they received an invitation to go to a retirement party, formally worded to be held in a ballroom at the Bib. President McCarran was listed as the host, a fact that made David, even in his somewhat incapacitated state, scoff. Peter McCarran, who had replaced President Pierce several years prior, was despised by David for reasons Ada never fully understood. McCarran was a short, rough man, quite unlike his stately predecessor. He was pushy and red-faced, a bulldog, good at fundraising but bad at math. That idiot, David said, any time his name was raised. Good old McCarran, he said now, ruefully, more slowly than he might have before. He probably couldn't wait to see me go. The dinner itself was on a Friday night, David's last official day of work. Ada was to meet him at the lab that afternoon. After her school day ended, in the morning, David had come downstairs in an unironed button-down shirt, and Ada pleaded with him to go back upstairs and put on a suit. She herself ran home briefly after school to change out of her school uniform and into a dress that was slightly too small for her, a pretty one that Liston had helped her pick out the summer before on one of the shopping trips she sometimes orchestrated for Ada, to David's mild disgust. The dress, made of light yellow cotton, was too summery for April, and to compensate, Ada had paired it with black tights, black patent leather shoes, and a blue ski parka, her only winter jacket. She hoped to do without it, but it was still cold that April, and it would not warm up for a month. She looked odd, even she knew it, but she had few other options. She ran to the key through a chilly rain. Inside, she produced a piece of paper she had been carrying in her pocket all day. This was her secret. At Liston's urging, she had composed a speech in her father's honor, a description of his career, the awards he'd won, the impact he'd had on his field. She stayed up late every night that week, working in her bedroom with one light on, neglecting the homework her teachers at Queen of Angels had assigned her. My father, David Sibelius, it began, is retiring after nearly 30 years of running the Steiner Laboratory. She had crafted it carefully to emphasize his great accomplishments, the nobility of his character, while keeping it relatively restrained and dignified. She had tried to make it funny. If there was one thing David hated, she knew it was sentimentality. When she reached the lab, she went straight to Liston's office. Don't you look pretty? Said Liston, standing up from behind her desk, taking off the reading glasses she needed but professed to hate. She too had dressed up for David's dinner. She was wearing an oversized pink blazer that both clashed with and set off her hair. She had applied more blush than usual. She was wearing big, dangly earrings in geometrical shapes. She would be the one assuming David's role as head of the lab. She looked as if she had attempted to dress in a way that reflected her promotion, but even Ada knew she had gotten it slightly wrong. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 hours before the dinner was set to begin. Shyly, Ada produced from her pocket the speech she had written and asked if Liston would mind looking at it. Then she sat down on the beanbag chair that she had slept in often as a child and stared at the floor and waited anxiously for Liston to respond. Ah, Ada, Liston said, I think it's perfect. When she looked up, Ada saw that the little pools of tears were hovering precariously above Liston's lower lashes. Thank you again, Malimo. Hippo, threatening to spill over. Liston smiled briefly and then let her face drop. Ada studied her. She was a pretty woman, 43 that year, slightly plump, soft-featured. To Ada, she looked perpetually like a teenager. Ada had never been privy to the dressing table rituals and ministrations of women. She mistook Liston's fashion sense, her dyed red hair, the mascara she wore, for signifiers of youth. I'm sorry, said Liston, and she let out a sad little laugh. I'll just miss having you here, that's all, both of you. All 6 colleagues filed out, one at a time, from the main room of the Steiner lab. Charles, Robert, and then Liston, and then Frank, and then Hayato, and then David. Ada left last, and placing a hand on the wall behind her, she tapped the light switch down instinctively, without having to search for it. She looked backward into the darkened office, and it felt in a way as if she were leaving her life and her body behind, as if, when she closed the door behind her, she would become a ghost, something spectral and discarnate, something without a home. She wondered if this was what David felt like all the time. She wondered what would happen next. Oh, thank you again, Jerry. The dinner was held in the faculty dining room of the BIT, which had been decorated with linens and flowers. David had already declined to speak, and so he settled uncomfortably down into his chair at the table that had been reserved for the 6 of them, along with the provost, President McCarran, and Miss McCarran, a tidy woman who tried to make polite small talk with David until at last she gave up hope. David's posture was slumped. His head hung low. When people spoke to him, he did not meet their gaze, but turned his own to hover someplace around their mouths, as if trying to read their lips. He did not eat until he was reminded to by Ada. He smiled politely as one after another his colleagues at the bit and some from other institutions spoke about his achievements and intelligence, his wit and generosity, but the naming of these qualities was to Ada only a cruel generosity, but only a cruel reminder of their recent disappearance. David got tired easily now. Once or twice his eyes closed completely, and Ada jostled him as subtly as she could. Ada was due to speak last. She fell in the pocket of her coat, which she had insisted on hanging over the back of her chair for her speech. The paper, by then, was soft with the wear of being handled, being worried over. She produced it and put it in her lap, glanced down at it when she could, but as dessert was being served, and while the provost was speaking, David turned to her and asked too loudly if she was ready to leave. Ada shook her head once, quickly. President McCarran had heard him. Ada was not certain how much the rest of their university knew about the reasons for his retirement. Certainly, the other members of the lab were protective enough of David not to have said too much. To anyone, but in that moment she realized that everyone must have known that something was wrong with her father. Come on now, Ada, said David. Really, let's go. Politely, McCarran averted his gaze. Ada leaned toward him and whispered to him urgently. It's for you, she said. The dinner is for you. We can't leave yet. David was shaking his head slowly, as if he had not heard her. I've got to go, he said, and unsteadily he stood up from his chair. He held a hand up to the rest of the table. Okay, he said, bye to all now. Ada stood up too. She wanted to reach out to him, to pull him forcibly back by his elbow, but she felt that would be worse. Her speech fell from her lap onto the floor, and she bent to retrieve it. Without meaning to, she caught Liston's eye as she rose, and on her face Ada saw a look of such sadness, such pity, that she quickly turned away. Together, she and David left through a side door, and behind her, Ada heard the provost stutter and then pause. Well, he said, I guess our guest of honor is indisposed. Then they were outside, and they stood together for a while on the sidewalk while Ada decided what to do next. The rain had stopped, but it was bitterly cold, too cold for April. Can we take a cab? Ada asked, something that David abhorred. To him, taxis were for the lazy, the fiscally irresponsible, but she thought it was worth asking, for she was shivering even in her ski parka, and that night he immediately agreed. In the taxi, Ada was silent, furious. She said nothing except to give the driver directions. When Ada failed to, David rested his head against the headrest, closing his eyes for a while. She looked over him resentfully in the yellow light from the storefronts and street lamps. He looked sickly and old. She had been noticing lately that his physical size was shrinking. Although he had always been thin, he had seemed shorter recently, more stooped, as if he had aged 5 years in a week. His eyes had dark circles beneath them. She supposed he had been handsome once. His stature had helped him to be so. He was uncommonly old when she had been born, yes, but he'd always seemed young for his years. He was tall and well built, at least, with fine features and bright, inquisitive eyes. When he felt Like it, he was capable of listening intently for hours on end. Women had always liked him. Ada was not oblivious to this fact, but he was changed now, more like a grandfather than a father, someone incapable of offering her protection. She felt unsteady and unsafe. At home, Ada retreated to her room without saying goodnight. She turned on her computer, pulled Elixir up to have a talk. And then she heard the sound of David's footsteps on the stairs, heard a faint knock on her door. It was rare for David to come to her room. She had no memories of him sitting on the edge of her bed, reading her a story as she drifted to sleep. Though he read to her, it was always downstairs in the living room, in a somewhat businesslike manner. She sitting in one chair, he in another. And when she tired, Ada would trot upstairs and put herself to bed. At 4 years old, she knew how to brush her teeth, wash her face, comb her hair so it would not tangle. She knew how to don her nightgown to tuck her little body into bed. Now, she went to her bedroom door and opened it a crack. She was still wearing her ridiculous outfit, banana-colored dress, heavy black tights. David looked distressed. The light in the hallway was off. She could see him only in the light cast upon him by her little desk lamp. "May I come in, Ada?" he said. She opened the door a bit more. There was only one chair in her room at her desk. David claimed his, so she sat down on her twin bed across from him. He looked at her seriously. "I want to apologize," he said. Ada was silent. "I've spent a great deal of time denying what's become undeniable recently," he continued. "That my mind is most certainly being taken from me. Slowly. This is a truth that I have found it difficult to confront." She looked at him. She felt recalcitrant, unswayed. "I can tell you're upset. While I have my wits about me," said David, "while I am relatively mentally intact, I want to tell you what it has meant to me to have you as my daughter. Ada, you cannot imagine." "Now," he said, holding up one hand to stop her as she opened her mouth to speak. "Now, it's true that great innovations in the field of medical research and technology are becoming," he trailed off, looking down at his palms, as if wishing for notes. "Innovations in medicine and technology," said Ada. "Yes," said David. "There is a chance that some intervention will occur in my lifetime that will reverse the course of what I now see as my inevitable decline. A small and improbable chance, but a chance nonetheless. That said, I don't think you should cling to this hope, because, as we both must accept, the likeliest course of events is that I will die before you've reached adulthood. And therefore, that is my prediction, and that is the path for which you should prepare yourself." Ada nodded. She was sitting very still on her bed. She was still wearing her coat. Her right hand was in her pocket, grasping the speech she had written about her father. She wondered whether she should give it to him. "It is also possible," said David, "that you will one day learn some things about me that are difficult to understand. I think every child goes through this process. The problem is that I will not be here, perhaps mentally, perhaps physically, to explain them to you or to guide you through them, and therefore you must trust me when I say that everything I have done has been out of a wish for a better life for myself and for you, and everything I have done has been in our best interest. All right, Ada?" She didn't move. She watched him. His gaze was beseeching. He leaned forward in his chair to look at her. "Do you understand?" he asked her. And at last she nodded, though at that time she did not. "Finally, I have never been a religious man," said David, "but I also have some notion that this is not the conclusion of our story. My dear, I think it quite possible that our paths may cross again some day, whatever that may look like." "Thank you for listening," said David. He stood up, somewhat painfully, and walked to the door. "I'll miss talking with you most," he said, and then he was gone. All right, that's the end of that chapter. Well, you know how they are. They're not like titled, but yeah. We pick up on the next chapter tomorrow. Hopefully, I'll get some more work done tomorrow. There's always some things I need to get done, always, but um, hopefully, I'm getting somewhere. I have to get some signs for her. I have to get ugh, I really need to do something to get my dishwasher installed soon. As part of the cleaning is this huge thing there. Anyway, you don't need all in task, but by the time I see you tomorrow, hopefully I'll have gotten some more stuff done. And then I read to you some more. I love you so much. I'll go back to my swelter, but I'm still here. I love you. Good night.